Hey, it's Josh Vergara from Android Authority. What's going on, everybody? And every photo and video that you're seeing in this camera shootout was taken on the Galaxy S7. A trip to the Broad Museum in LA is the backdrop for this camera feature focus. But first, we did want to take a look at the front-facing camera, and it does provide some good quality. It is nice to use and is just wide enough, but you can still use the wide selfie if you want to add more people in. One thing about the front-facing camera's flash, however, is basically just a very bright screen, but it still provides a somewhat harsh light to the subject. That said, however, back to the Broad. We do have a lot of pictures from here, and I am going to do 100 crops from time to time just to show you that the 12 megapixel pictures of the rear-facing camera of the Galaxy S7 does lose just a little bit of the sharpness when compared to its 16 megapixel counterparts from the Galaxy S6. Now again, that is not to say that the pictures are terrible by any means. They are still quite sharp. It's just that they aren't quite as crisp as they used to be. Now another thing about this batch of photos is that we're in a less lit situation. The lighting in this part of the Broad Museum was not necessarily ideal, so what you're going to find is that the white balance on the camera is more towards the warm side, and that's something that in auto mode the camera of the Galaxy S7 does tend to do quite a lot. And like I mentioned before and in the review, the front-facing camera of the Galaxy S7 can record in Quad HD resolution, which is incredibly handy, especially for anybody that's looking to vlog, or in the case of this shot right here, I just wanted to put the camera down and be sure that I framed it properly, and I could use the front-facing camera and of course the viewfinder in order to make sure I got the shot right. 4K video recording is available in the rear-facing camera. However, if you turn on the 4K recording, you do lose some of the functions, including the software-enhanced video stabilization. But OIS does tend to do a pretty good job with stabilizing the videos. What I do like in video, however, is taking advantage of the autofocus. Now, autofocus before you take your picture is already pretty great, but in videos, it does make for a pretty crisp and clean way of focusing on a subject. We move into a video installation, and this was a place that I can actually show why you would use the Pro mode over just the Auto mode all the time. In this particular photo in the Auto mode, it is trying to expose for the entire picture. However, I would like to make sure that my brother is more backlit, have more of a silhouette, and by going into the Pro mode and turning up the shutter speed, I'm able to achieve that particular effect. Now moving into the top floor of the Broad Museum, the lighting was much better, and you're going to see that the pictures already have a better white balance to them. But this was also a situation that I could have used for the panorama mode. Now in this panorama mode, one thing to note is that on the left, the gentleman in the hat was actually walking while I was doing this motion with the panorama, and it was able to stitch him without having to have that blur. A quick note about sensor sizes and the aspect ratios. Now, the reason why all of the photos are like this is because I wanted to take advantage of the entire 12 megapixel sensor, which is of a 4:3 size and ratio. When you want to do 16:9 photos, it will actually crop down the sensor to a 9 megapixel photo. And the same goes for videos as well. One thing that I did notice is that by taking a photo in the 4:3 ratio and then hitting record for videos, it had a zoomed in effect. The main reason being that it had to zoom in and crop the sensor, so it seems like everything was a little bit more zoomed in than it should be. Now, with HDR is not something that you can really have on all the time and expect to have this kind of effect on all the time. You can have it on auto, and the phone will figure out in high contrast situations to turn on HDR, but these are just examples of illustrating what kind of situations HDR will actually give you that more blown up effect, with the shadows that are raised up and the highlights that might be brought down, for example, in the sky. Alright, next leg of the day, heading over to Grand Central Market, where we could probably wait for about 4 hours for an egg. The hyperlapse mode is basically a very sped up video, but the Galaxy S7 does do some of the work in terms of stabilizing the footage. Now, Grand Central Market was another indoor, maybe less lit situation, which provided more examples of how the auto mode in the Galaxy S7 tends to go to the warmer side of the temperature, color temperature that is, when in lower light situations. But overall, the results might be a little bit mixed in terms of the auto white balance, but overall, the detail and the colors still look pretty nice, and you are always able to modify the pictures in post. And of course, I have to do the foodie shot. In this particular photo, though, it's another illustration of how the sharpness when zooming into a photo is a little bit less this time around. The very lines of the meat inside of this burrito are not very crisp, and there's a noise reduction trying to compensate for it, which makes the entire area just look that little bit more smudged out. As we move into the final portions of this camera feature focus, I did want to show a couple more photos of HDR. Now, the saturation in HDR photos does get bumped up a little bit, but as you can see in these pictures and in these high contrast situations, it's more about bringing up the shadows for the most part in order to even out the entire image. And finally, a set of lower light situations. Now, this was in an indoor area where there really wasn't a whole lot of lighting, so what we're going to do is zoom into these photos, and you can see that the details are getting less and less, which is to be expected, and the color temperature is even more to the warmer side. But what's important to note here is that in these situations, it was really easy to get these photos, and they are really workable. The 1.4 micron sized pixels of the S7 really do a good job of flooding in the light, and that was the point of bringing the camera from 16 to 12 megapixels. So in these lower light situations, you will get very nice photos, even if when zoomed in, you're going to see the differences in terms of detail. Now, especially when you're outdoors and there are like street lamps or any signs in front of storefronts, you'll have blown out areas where those lights are. That's something you're just going to have to contend with, and you can expose for them, but then you're going to get a high contrast shot. It's in these situations that HDR might help out a little bit, but overall, the main thing to take away here is that the low light performance of the S7 is definitely so much better than it ever has been before. And so that should do it for this camera feature focus on the Galaxy S7. Overall, it's a great package and a great shooter to have, especially as a companion on the daily. And even if the details might be a little bit less, that's something you're really only going to see if you're pixel peeping. The bottom line, however, is that low light performance has been bumped up, and the overall general performance in more well-lit situations is still pretty much as good as ever, with just a couple of caveats. From there, however, you can find all of our Galaxy S7 coverage here at AndroidAuthority.com, including the full review, which has been released already, so you can click on over and find that, and stay tuned for even more, because we are your source for all things Android.